final torque to 65 foot-pounds on cars with total contact brakes, and you won't have any trouble on that score.
Pull the drum off one wheel of a 1960 Chrysler New Yorker and count the hydraulic cylinders sitting behind it. 2. Not one like Ford used. Not one like GM used. Chrysler doubled it on every single corner of the car, all the way from 57 through 62, across pretty much the entire full-size lineup. And here's what really gets me about this whole thing. This is the same company that had four-wheel disc brakes on the Crown Imperial back in 1949. Full 4 years before Jaguar showed up at Le Mans, with discs, and everybody acted like it was some kind of revolution. Chrysler had already been there and done that. So why in 1960 was this company still pouring engineering hours into a drum brake? Not just any drum either. The most over-engineered drum brake system that was ever fitted to an American production car. They called it Total Contact. The engineers internally called it Center Plane. And if you've never heard of it, that's because Chrysler killed it so quietly that even most Mopar guys today have no idea what they're looking at when they pull the drums off a late 50s Chrysler product. Alright, so to understand why this system existed at all, you have to know what Chrysler had just walked away from. And this part of the story is kind of painful, honestly. In 1949, the Crown Imperial came standard with a four-wheel disc brake system built under Homer Lambert's patents, manufactured by Auto Specialties out of St. Joseph, Michigan. Now, these weren't caliper discs like what you'd see on a modern car. They used twin rotating discs that would spread apart inside a cast iron housing, self-energizing through a ball ramp mechanism that multiplied whatever the driver was putting into the pedal. Ran cooler than drums. Resisted fade. Gave you roughly a third more friction surface than Chrysler's own 12-inch drums. But, and there's always a but with Chrysler in this era, the system added about $400 to the sticker price. And in a world where you could buy an entire Chrysler Hotshot for $935, most buyers just looked at that number and said, no thanks. By 1955, Chrysler dropped the discs entirely. Didn't even try to retool them to bring the cost down. Just killed them. So here's where it gets interesting. Instead of figuring out how to make a cheaper disc brake, Chrysler went completely the other direction. They decided to push the drum brake as far as it could possibly go. And if you ask me, they pushed it further than anyone else in Detroit ever bothered trying. I came across a quote from an old drum brake designer while researching this, who said drums could be just as good as discs if manufacturers were willing to spend the money on them. Well, Chrysler actually went and tried to prove that theory right. So what was the Total Contact brake actually like inside? The conventional Bendix Duo servo setup that Ford and GM both ran had one wheel cylinder per wheel, pushing two shoes outward against the drum. One leading shoe, one trailing shoe, and the drum's rotation would drag the leading shoe tighter through what engineers call the servo effect. Worked fine, light pedal feel, but the clamping force was never even. Leading shoe did most of the heavy lifting, while the trailing shoe kind of just tagged along, not really contributing much. Chrysler's fix was to put two hydraulic cylinders in every wheel instead of one. Now both shoes become leading shoes, both self-energizing against the drum at the same time, pushing outward from the center plane of the assembly, which is where the engineering name comes from. Braking force was symmetrical and significantly stronger than a comparable single-cylinder setup using the same size drum. This went into full-size Chrysler, DeSoto, Dodge, and some Plymouth models from 57 through 62, both 11-inch and 12-inch drum sizes depending on the application. Now the shoe adjustment on these was entirely manual, no self-adjusters like the Bendix system had. You set the clearance using cam-ground anchor bolts with a 7/16 hex head, and factory spec was 5 to 10 thousandths at the toe and heel ends of each shoe. And I know what most people would assume here. You want the lining sitting as tight against the drum as possible. That's actually backwards with these brakes. If the shoe contacted the drum in the middle of the lining first, what the engineers called belly contact, the pedal went spongy and braking was terrible. You needed that precise gap at the ends so the shoe would seat progressively against the drum surface. That one detail goes against what almost any shade tree mechanic would guess on instinct, and it's a big part of why these brakes got a reputation for being a nightmare to work on. Parking brake is genuinely unusual on these cars too. On a Total Contact car, the parking brake was not in the rear wheels at all. Separate 6-inch drum bolted to the tail shaft of the transmission. I know a lot of people today think rear drums survived as long as they did, mainly because they made parking brakes easy to package. and that's true for the Bendix system. Chrysler went a completely different direction and moved the parking brake out of the wheel assembly entirely. Different philosophy. One more detail that I think the Chrysler guys in the comments will appreciate. Return springs on these brakes were color-coded. Originals were dark red, but Chrysler found the shoes weren't retracting consistently, which caused this maddening pedal where it felt fine on one stop, then went low on the next stop, and you couldn't figure out why. Their fix was a new set of springs that pulled 10 pounds harder, and they painted them bright red so a mechanic could tell at a glance whether the car had the updated ones or the old ones, just by looking at the color. If you're working on a 57 to 62 Chrysler product right now, and you see dark red springs in there, that's probably your problem right there. Swap them out. Everything I just described works beautifully when it's set up right by somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Problem is, the total contact system was completely unforgiving of sloppy work. And in the real world, a lot of the work being done on these cars was sloppy. That's just the reality of it. Most common nightmare was shoes hanging up on the dust shield platforms instead of retracting when the driver let off the pedal. Contact loops on the shoes would dig into the platforms. Paint buildup would make them stick. Fix was almost stupidly simple. You tap the tire a few times with a rubber mallet, just enough to jar the shoes loose, and the wheel that was dragging suddenly frees right up. Worked every single time. But if you didn't know that trick, you could bleed the entire hydraulic system, readjust every shoe on the car, road test it, tell the customer it's fixed, and then get a phone call the next morning saying the pedal is right back on the floor. That is the kind of experience that made mechanics absolutely dread seeing a '59 Dodge pull into the service bay. Squeal problem 2. Some mechanics in period described the shoes vibrating against the drum like a tuning fork. High-pitched ringing that no lining material anybody tried seemed to cure. And then there's the complexity of just doing a basic brake job on one of these. 4-wheel cylinders on each car, and every single one was indexed to its position, left or right, upper or lower. You accidentally swap 2 of them during a brake job, and you're tearing the whole thing apart again to fix your mistake. For a dealer tech doing 3 brake jobs a day, that kind of fussiness wears you down fast. For a factory assembly line stamping out hundreds of cars per shift, it was a cost problem that just kept getting worse. And since I know somebody in the comments is going to bring it up, yes. Brake shoes in this era contained asbestos. The factory training films from the early 60s actually show technicians blowing brake dust out with a compressed air hose straight into the shop air. No mask, no ventilation, nothing. That was completely normal practice well into the 80s. Obviously, we know a lot better now. 2 things happened almost at the same time, and between them, they killed the total contact brake for good. 1962, Chrysler introduced the all-aluminum 727 TorqueFlite automatic. If you've watched my TorqueFlite video, you already know that transmission. Built into the 727 was a parking sprag, a mechanical locking pawl inside the gearbox that held the car when parked. That right there eliminated the need for the separate 6-inch parking brake drum on the transmission tailshaft, which was one of the reasons the total contact rear brake assembly could be so clean in the first place. Then in '63, the New Yorker and the rest of the full-size Chrysler lineup switched from 12-inch total contact brakes to 11-inch Bendix Duo servo brakes. Same basic system Ford and GM had been running for years. Cheaper, self-adjusting, and any mechanic in any shop anywhere in the country already knew how to work on them without cracking open a training manual. Now here's what I find kind of fascinating about this whole thing. Chrysler never publicly said the total contact system failed. Far as I can tell, there was no press release, no engineering paper, no internal memo has ever surfaced explaining the decision. They just quietly moved on and never talked about it. And if you step back and look at the pattern, it's actually the second time in less than 10 years that Chrysler abandoned a braking system they genuinely believed was technically superior to everything else on the road. Disc brakes killed in '55. Total contact drums killed in '63. Both times, same answer. Too expensive, too complex, too dependent on tight tolerances and skilled hands to survive in a world where Detroit needed to stamp out cars by the thousands every single day and have any mechanic anywhere be able to fix them. And here's the final irony, and it's a rough one for Chrysler fans. The company didn't offer disc brakes again until 1966. That means the manufacturer that literally pioneered disc brakes in America in 1949 was one of the last of the big 3 to bring them back. 17 years later. Ha! If you own a 57 to 62 full-size Chrysler, DeSoto, Dodge, or Plymouth, you are sitting on one of these systems right now. Parts are getting harder to find, especially those 4-position indexed wheel cylinders. Good luck with those. There's a long-running argument on the Mopar forums about whether to keep the original center plane brakes or convert to a front disc setup, and I honestly understand both sides of it. If you can get them dialed in with the right springs, clean platforms, proper campground clearance, these are genuinely excellent drum brakes. Arguably the best ever fitted to an American car. But if you're driving in modern traffic where the guy behind you is on his phone and not paying attention, and you might need to make a panic stop from 60, a disc conversion starts looking pretty reasonable. I don't think anybody should feel bad about making that choice if safety is the concern. One more thing worth mentioning for anyone actually wrenching on these. If you're running .5 silicone fluid in one of these cars, be careful with it. Silicone can trap micro air bubbles that are nearly impossible to bleed out if the cylinder bores aren't within about 0.002. You will chase a spongy pedal forever, and you will never find a leak because there isn't one. The bubbles are the problem. Just something to be aware of before you start pouring silicone fluid into a brake system that's more than 60 years old. So, that's the story of the Total Contact Brake. Chrysler built the most sophisticated drum brake system America ever saw. On paper, it was better than anything Ford or GM offered by a pretty wide margin. And then they walked away from it because the real world doesn't care about paper. It cares about cost, about scale, about whether the guy at the corner garage can figure the thing out without watching a factory training film first. If you ever owned or wrenched on a Total Contact car, 57 to 62 New Yorker, Dodge Custom Royal, DeSoto, 300-letter car, any of them, I want to hear about it in the comments. Was it as fussy as the old mechanics all said it was, or did you get yours sorted out and never look back? And for those of you who already pulled the trigger on a disc conversion, was it worth it, or do you miss how the originals felt when everything was set up right? Let me know. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out. And I will see you all in the next one, enthusiasts.